But now and for, are we walking into a police state? It's dispatches.
Members of this Labour government once spoke out eloquently for civil liberty. That government is now enacting measures from identity cards to restrictions on free speech that are unprecedented in modern times. And its leader maintains that these new laws are needed to make us all safer.
The whole of our system starts from the proposition that its duty is to protect the innocent from being wrongly convicted. Don't misunderstand me, that must be the duty of any criminal justice system. But surely our primary duty should be to allow law-abiding people to live in safety.
There is little evidence that these new laws and powers are actually making us any more secure. But there is evidence that such changes are making us less free to speak our minds, and more filed, docketed and snooped upon than any other free country on the planet.
Most of us tend to think that democracy and liberty are more or less the same thing. But actually, British freedom was born centuries before everyone had the vote. And modern-day British politicians are seeking and winning popularity by trying to undermine many of those ancient freedoms. Once they've gone, will we ever get them back? Is the state a fit guardian for those liberties? Is democracy in danger of destroying our liberty?
For centuries, the British people have come to Westminster to protest when they disagree with their rulers. That right is now under threat. The law now states that you need police permission to demonstrate near Parliament. Even some former communist states do not apply such restrictions. Last year, Maya Evans, a 25-year-old cook from Hastings, and some of her friends mounted a campaign to protest against the war in Iraq. They decided to take their protest to the Cenotaph, near Parliament.
So, you came here on October morning, just to make your protest against the amount of killing that had happened in Iraq. It's not really terribly controversial, is it?
I didn't think so.
Their plan, as in other protests, was to read, reverently and quietly, the names of those killed in the current war.
My colleague and I placed the A1 posters in front of us. We've got our lists out, and I was reading out the names of the British soldiers. Master Engineer Gary Nicholson, age 42.
Chief Technician Richard Brown, aged 40.
Flight Sergeant Mark Gibson, age 34.
Sergeant Robert O'Connor, aged 38. We can read out these names for as long as we like, because we're not making a protest, we're making a television programme. But if this were a protest, we would already now be facing arrest under the Serious Organised Crimes and Police Act 2005, and could be taken away under arrest, have our DNA, fingerprints and photographs taken. As it is, we're not making a protest, so we can carry on reading.
Sergeant Robert O'Connor, age 38.
Corporal David Williams, age 37.
But Maya and her friends were making a protest, if not for long.
Within 30 seconds, a group of officers came over and they pointed out that we were in a restricted protest zone and that our protest had been unauthorised.
The problem was they had no official permission.
The officer said, "I'm arresting you under the Serious Organised Crime Police Act 2005, I think section 132, and I came along peacefully."
One of Maya's friends filmed the police escorting her off the scene.
How many of them did it take to arrest you?
I think the official number is 14, but I only remember about 8, to be honest.
There's a pretty direct connection between this monument and English liberty. The people whose sacrifice is commemorated here died so that their children could grow up British, enjoying the freedoms which they themselves had experienced. They would have found it incredible that you now have to seek police permission to hold a demonstration within 1,100 yards of Parliament.
The portentous-sounding Serious Organised Crime and Police Act 2005, supposedly directed against mafia-style crooks, landed Meyer with a criminal record. This is more than a change in the law. It is part of a wide and deep change in the way we are governed, supposedly justified by the need to combat crime and disorder. While wrongdoers seem largely unaffected by all this, innocent citizens find that they are ruled by an increasingly officious and heavy hand. Simran Shah is an ordinary 19-year-old, but a few months ago he was the victim of some extraordinary policing.
I was going down the escalator and I saw the British Transport Police, kind of like a diamond formation. So I thought I'd take a photo of that with my camera phone. And then when I arrived at the bottom of the escalator, one of the British Transport Police came over, pulled me aside and searched me. They then took down my details, my height, my name, address, what clothes I was wearing.
You may think this was fair enough if the police really had believed Simran was a potential terrorist, but their behaviour suggests they were just throwing their weight around.
He barely even looked through the camera to find the photo, and he couldn't find it, and he kind of gave up. Had I been a terrorist, I would still have that photo on my camera. The idea of being in some sort of file or some sort of database under the Prevention of Terrorism Act is, of course, a completely daunting and horrible thought, especially if you are totally innocent.
In one way, Simran is lucky. Though his name is doubtless on some database or other, he was spared the treatment meted out to another victim of such pointless officiousness. Matthew Dodd is Mr. Harmless, a teenage train spotter. Free countries breed such people, eccentrics whose baffling enthusiasms are happily tolerated. But in Britain, raw suspicion is starting to replace that tolerance. And so it was that on a winter's afternoon last year in Birmingham, Matthew Dodd spotted something rotten in the state of Britain.
I was photographing the 1748 to Manchester to Piccadilly. It's one of Virgin's older trains, which seems to be of a general interest to a railway enthusiast like myself. And I was just casually standing with my camera out and my tripod. It was set up. This is just totally normally.
But that was the last normal thing that happened that day.
I was approached by a Network Rail officer who said that it was not permitted to take photographs on the station. And eventually he came to the conclusion that I had an attitude of some description and that I would have to deal with the British Transport Police. 3 officers it was, came down, and I was given a full body search.
Full body search? This is in a public place?
This is in a public place,
so
in front of...
So anyone who was watching could have thought that you were some kind of terrorist suspect?
Yeah, and it certainly felt that way.
The police who humiliated this gentle rail enthusiast seemed utterly absent when real trouble threatened at the same station.
I had a friend the other day who had a purse nicked. We saw nothing of the police, yet when I was doing something innocent, carrying out an innocent hobby, anyone could be getting away with anything. When the security people are down here dealing with my threat.
The police feel this kind of incident is unavoidable while they fight the terrorist threat.
You can't say what a terrorist looks like in the general sense. It could come from any background, any sex, any religion, any race. Police officers went along to talk to Mr. Dodd, and he was obviously found to be a rail enthusiast and went on his way. And I'm not saying we did get it wrong, but when one has 35,000 stops as we've had this year, from time to time we won't always get them right. We'll use our powers as appropriate to try and stop people causing further outrages to the system.
If there's anything in the world more innocent than train spotting, I don't know what it is. But thanks to our anti-terrorism legislation, it's now possible for someone to be searched in public for daring to take photographs of trains. Meanwhile, In the stations in the background, crime and disorder carry on completely uninterrupted.
The strange paradox is that the tougher the police seem to be on the innocent, the more ineffectual they seem to be when it comes to dealing with actual crime. In and around the south coast resort of Bournemouth, many shopkeepers feel abandoned by the law. One of them is Mike Vincent. He showed me an astonishing letter local traders received from a neighbourhood constable about reporting crime.
So I respectfully request that prior to calling the police, consideration be given as to whether the matter could be dealt with within the store. I would like to recommend that the police are not called in the case of goods below a value of £75. If someone walked in here and took, I don't know, 4 or 5 things off a shelf here, anything worth less than £75, then the police didn't want you to call them, didn't think it was worth bothering.
That was what the letter insinuated, without any element of doubt. That is encouraging the lads to do it. You know, they can walk in and say, right, well, I know I can nick 70 quid's worth and nothing's going to happen.
There was also a warning against infringing the human rights of any thieves they might happen to catch.
It says, a further problem can be encountered if when you have detained a person, you have taken their liberty. If there is delay in the arrival of the police, which does happen quite often, there could be a breach of human rights.
After much negative publicity, the letter has since, unsurprisingly, been withdrawn. But what about the thinking behind it? Despite being overwhelmed by rising crime, officers have seldom been so hamstrung in the face of theft and violence. Yet they also seem curiously zealous when it comes to investigating unfashionable opinions. In the bleak coastal town of Fleetwood, just north of Blackpool, such opinions can get you into deep trouble. In December of last year, an incident here highlighted the way in which British police forces have changed their priorities, away from the concerns of ordinary people and towards political policing, curtailing what we say and feel. Joe and Helen Roberts, respectable and hard-working, felt they'd earned a peaceful retirement. But late-night noise and worse at a nearby playground have blighted their peace.
You can see all the filth and the debris that's around. It's not respected or looked
Well, do you get needles in there?
They have been found, yes. We lock our front door as soon as it goes dark every night because of the young ones about.
So you're afraid of that?
Yes.
It's not safe, is it?
It's not.
Police everywhere seem reluctant to turn out to deal with what is dismissed as petty crime.
Now, if you went to Fleetwood police station at 6 o'clock in the evening, what would you find?
It'd be closed.
Nobody there?
Nobody there.
How often do you see a patrolling policeman on these streets?
Oh, usually about one a day. It's the community officers more than the police that you see, the voluntary police.
This is not just the tale of a retired couple neglected by the law. It has a more disturbing side. One night the police did come to see them. The Robertses thought their cry had at last been heard.
And my wife answered the front door and it was 2 policemen. And he asked her was she Mrs. Roberts, who was continually complaining about the playground over the road. So my wife let him in the house, and when he came in, the policeman reached inside his pocket, he pulled these papers out and turned around and said he'd had a phone call from Borough Council, as we'd made homophobic phone calls.
The playground problems were a mere pretext. What they really wanted to probe was a local council official's complaint about the couple's views. A few days earlier, Joe, an active Christian, had phoned the town hall to complain about its plans to promote homosexuality on council property.
I phoned up and asked him that could I please put Christian literature alongside the homosexual literature.
We were concerned that all this literature was going to be made public and we wanted a Christian voice then.
And I was told no, as homosexuals would find it very discriminatory and offensive.
The 2 officers proceeded to lecture Joe and Helen on the wickedness of their opinions.
And they've proceeded to talk to us and explain that this homophobic phone call, that we were walking on eggshells and it was verging near to a hate crime and that we needed to be very careful because hate crimes gave a 7-year prison sentence.
A 7-year prison sentence? So that they suggested to you that what you were doing could put you in prison for 7 years?
If we carried on and went any further than what we did, yes, we were walking on eggshells, we were warned.
Didn't you find this very intimidating?
Yes, we did.
While regretting any distress, neither the council nor the police have backed down. The police say the decision to send the officers round was correct. The council say their employee acted in good faith. Such action is often justified because of the alleged offence that can result from traditional moral views. As it happens, one of those most entitled to take such offence thinks the Robertses have every right to their opinions.
If I sat down with this couple and talked with them, I doubt that I would agree much about their views on homosexuality. But nor would I agree with the police intervening and threaten them with prosecution and possibly a jail term for expressing their point of view. In a free and democratic society, we sometimes have to put up with views we disagree with, we find offensive, perhaps even insulting, because that is the price of freedom.
Just as the police seem to be becoming less and less effective at dealing with ordinary crime, burglary, mugging and car thefts, they become more and more involved in political policing. Something nobody in this country would ever have thought was their job until very recently, because what they're supposed to do is to deter crime, not to investigate what people are thinking and saying.
I think in the current climate there are some elements of what one might call political correctness which has come into policing. And there have been occasions where I think out of a sense of political correctness, the police have involved themselves, and they would argue quite rightly so. I'm sure there are others who would say that all that was required was a little piece of common sense.
I'm going to see Labour peer Brian Mackenzie. He was a policeman for 35 years, rising to the rank of Chief Superintendent. He thought he, of all people, was entitled to criticise the new style of political policing, but he soon found himself on the receiving end of it.
I was invited onto the radio because Tony Blair, the Prime Minister, had allegedly, some 6 years ago I understand, during the Welsh Assembly elections, swore at the television. He'd used the F word against the Welsh. Rather to my surprise, I picked up in the press that they were busy investigating this alleged slur.
I'm joined live by Lord Mackenzie, who was President of the Police Superintendent Association of England and Wales.
I thought it was April the 1st when I first read about it. It's an absolute nonsense. But it looks like a fairly high-level decision to use these resources for such a trivial, minor issue.
To my great surprise, I received a letter from the Deputy Chief Constable of North Wales Police, Mr. Clive Wolfendale, criticising me for commenting on a case that I knew nothing about. But what was even worse was he made what I thought was a threatening comment.
Clive Wolfendale wrote, "Your contribution to the BBC programme was ill-considered and seemed personally motivated. In the event of a future occurrence, I shall be obliged to provide a response which is equally personal."
I was absolutely incensed, so I sent an equally robust letter back, pointing out that freedom of speech in this country is something that we value, and that the police really should think very carefully before they start interfering with it.
Lord Mackenzie retorted, "Your letter was reminiscent of something from a totalitarian regime, frightened of people expressing views with which you disagree. The police have been getting a bad press lately. You should ponder why before attacking the very liberties which form the foundations of our liberal democracy."
We're losing the plot, and cases where the police are investigating what people say is a frightening situation in modern Britain.
Brian Mackenzie was by no means the only one to face the New Thought police. Roman Catholic broadcaster Lynette Burrows was investigated for remarks on homosexuality made on the radio. Soon afterwards, so was a leader of Britain's Muslims, Sir Iqbal Sakrani. and even the former chief of the BBC was visited by officers after Anne Robinson was rude about the Welsh. This sort of policing may not be familiar here, but other countries know it all too well. Frederick Forsyth, now better known for his best-selling thrillers, is also a veteran foreign correspondent who spent many years reporting from the continent. He believes our Europhile authorities are replacing old English rules with continental ones.
The fact of the matter is that the nations of Western Europe were all conquered by Napoleon, and their law creeds are all based upon the Code Napoleon. He was a dictator, so he left behind a code that said the state is supreme and the citizen is subordinate. Centuries of English common law have said the state is actually the servant of the citizen. And so the concept that you are permitted to do anything, unless you're specifically forbidden to do it, that's British.
There was always an important difference between the police in Britain and practically anywhere else in the world. Here, they were the servants of the law and the friends of the public. Elsewhere, they were the servants of the state. Increasingly, in Britain, they are turning into the servants of the state, and of a pretty intolerant state at that.
But senior ministers shrug off these fears. They say nothing fundamental is changing.
What is it that makes them think these things are what a police force ought to be doing?
Again, I can't comment on the individual items,
sure,
and I don't know the facts of each of the individual items that you refer to.
It's a general question.
But is that, I question whether those particular examples represent the attitudes of the police across the country. The police's daily lives are not engaged, I would anticipate, in determining whether or not somebody's been guilty of racism because they've attacked the Welsh. Make a balanced judgment about how the police have changed. And I believe the police have changed very considerably over the last 8 years, but it's a process that's been going on for a period before that.
On that, we can both agree that the changes are not ones we should be welcoming.
The system itself is the problem. We are trying to fight 21st century crime, antisocial behaviour, drug dealing, binge drinking, organised crime, with 19th century methods.
The government say they're acting for the public good, and they don't need the old restraints. Trust us, they say. But what they don't say is that if we do trust them, we will be giving up the freedom we've enjoyed for centuries. Parliament has many times been the protector of our liberties, defying would-be tyrants and even overthrowing them. But not so in this era of the professional politician and mass propaganda.
I'm on my way to Victoria Tower at Westminster. Inside this majestic piece of Victorian fantasy architecture, the title deeds of English liberty are actually stored and still to be found.
The wise old cynics who devised our Constitution assumed that power would always be abused unless strong restraints were placed upon it. They were as right in the 17th century as they are now. Probably the most important laws they passed are the Habeas Corpus Act and the Bill of Rights, which state what government cannot do. No wonder today's rulers would prefer they were forgotten in the darkness.
I have never held in my hands anything so valuable as these two documents, the Bill of Rights and the Habeas Corpus Act. And I'm surrounded here in the Parliamentary Archives by similar documents, the accumulated wisdom of 1,000 years of history in which English people have limited power by law. Increasingly, we and our governments forget and ignore that history and seek to set aside that experience in pursuit of an illusory security which, far from making us safer, endangers the very freedom embodied in these archives.
Governments of both parties have recently sought to look tough by attacking these very limits on their power.
We're seeing laws that will allow people to be arrested without necessarily any consideration of the seriousness of the offence they might have caused. So I do think we're at the brink of a very dangerous situation.
The move to allow detention of suspects for 30 days is a direct blow at habeas corpus, which is meant to prevent anyone being held without charge. What's more, Labour and Tory governments have seriously discussed limiting jury trial.
I think the government wants to limit jury trial. One of the reasons for the jury being there as well is, of course, much greater transparency, and that of itself actually prevents any miscarriages of justice in the system itself.
The Prime Minister himself clearly thinks that he knows better than centuries of British tradition.
That means a complete change of thinking. It doesn't mean abandoning human rights. It does mean deciding who's come first. I believe three things work. First, a radical extension of summary powers to police and local authorities to take on the wrongdoers.
Summary powers are just what the famous Magna Carta set out to get rid of nearly 800 years ago. It declared no man could be locked up or fined except by the legal judgment of his peers. Astonishingly, the same government that brushes aside such things maintains that it is the defender of our freedoms.
Unlike any other government, we put the fundamental restraint of the courts to say that a whole act or a whole part of an act was incompatible with the Human Rights Convention. You know that the House of Lords ruled some of the government's legislation concerning terrorism as incompatible with the Human Rights Convention. We changed the legislation as a result. So far from being more controlling than previous governments, we are less controlling.
But you sound as if you were pleased that your legislation was struck down by the House of Lords, and you sound as if you were pleased that the House of Lords rebelled against so much of your legislation.
I am pleased that we've created a structure where there are appropriate checks and balances.
How is it that these benevolent, liberal-minded people have ended up presiding over the current bonfire of liberties?
Defend the children of the poor and punish the wrongdoer. That's what the Victorians thought the criminal justice system was for, but you won't find much punishment in the courts nowadays. For we don't believe in people doing wrong or doing right. We believe that crime is a sickness of society caused by poverty and deprivation and bad housing, and therefore it needs treating. But if it's a sickness, we're all potentially ill.
And as we all potentially have the disease of crime, the state feels justified in finding out more and more about us. In this vision of humanity with everyone a possible offender, the government would like a file on everyone. They've developed new techniques to help them. The Criminal Justice Act of 2003 gave police the right to keep the DNA of anyone they arrest. Since then, they have been building a DNA database. It even contains information on innocent children. You cannot get much more respectable than the London suburb of Harrow, or much more law-abiding than Helen Sabongia. Her father and her grandfather were both policemen. Her teenage son, Mark, had been seriously thinking of following the family tradition. But one winter's morning, he began to think again.
7:15 in the morning, we were woken up by 3 police officers who said they wanted to speak to my son, and we invited them in, and when my son came downstairs, they arrested him.
Mark had been the witness to a mugging and was wrongly identified as the culprit.
We got to the police station. They took Mark into another room and started to take his photograph and his fingerprints, and they took a swab in his mouth, his DNA.
The police rapidly realized that Mark was innocent. Helen assumed his DNA record would be destroyed.
You know, I said to the police officer, what's going to happen to his details? Are they going to be removed? And he said no. And we couldn't believe it. It was just not right. He's completely innocent, never committed any crime, so why is he on a database?
You can't make them do it. There's no legal right to force them to take it off.
I've got no right at all. It seems to be very, very difficult to get them removed. There's no procedure in place, it seems like.
Helen has written to the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir Ian Blair, asking for the records to be removed. But her attitude to the police has changed.
I mean, I say to Mark and my children now, if you see anything, don't get involved. Don't say anything, because you could end up being arrested as Mark was. My dad was a police officer and my granddad was a police officer. Mark had wanted to follow in the family tradition of joining the police force, but after this he's kind of, you know, gone off the idea.
Mark is one of many. There are now 24,000 under-18s on the official DNA database who have never been cautioned or convicted. Tory MP Grant Shapps is trying to get these records wiped before they lead to an even greater intrusion into our privacy.
The police actually seem to me to be very confused about the legislation. The law actually says that it's at their discretion to remove it. The problem is the police don't believe it's at their discretion, and they're certainly, I think, taking advantage of it to make sure they can build up their own database of as many children as possible.
If the police continue at the rate they're going, an estimated 4.25 million people will be on the DNA database by 2008.
My concern is that eventually this database will grow so large that the police will, the government will probably come back to Parliament and say, you know what, let's just tidy this up and make it compulsory and have everybody on the DNA database. And I think that this is really starting to concern people now, that actually this is all happening via the back door.
If you think such records won't be abused, listen to this. I'm on my way to Leeds to meet David Atkinson, a blameless law student who had the bad luck to have his fingerprints recorded. David's a confident young man who knows his law, yet he found himself in grave trouble.
I was out with a group of friends, and towards the end of the night, my friend went to the toilet and slipped on the floor of the toilet, and on his way down he pulled the toilet system from the wall.
As a result, David was arrested on suspicion of criminal damage. The charges were soon dropped, but the police kept his fingerprints and DNA. He thought nothing more of it, but a month later the police contacted him again.
I was told that they had forensic evidence linking me to a theft of mail from a postbox where a number of items of mail had been stolen and had been dusted for fingerprints which matched mine from I was arrested.
The police seemed convinced he'd done it, even though he was only 15 at the time.
Essentially, they've assumed my guilt based on the evidence that they had last time. It's as if there's a prejudice against people who've got their DNA and fingerprints on record. The police said again that it would be best for me to take a caution. I refused to do that as there's no way I was admitted to a crime that I hadn't done. Whilst I was at the custody desk, I asked the officer if he could give me the names and addresses that the items of mail were addressed to.
It turned out that the letters found at the crime scene were in fact Christmas cards which David himself had posted, and that's why his fingerprints were on them.
So the innocent explanation for it came to light, spoke to the officer again, and I was told that I would be released and no further action would be taken. However, I still have all my details on the police records.
Do you really think that giving the state and the police those powers increases the freedom of the individual?
You pose the dilemma there, don't you? Suppose that your fingerprints are found at the scene of the crime, and you've given your fingerprints because you've been arrested wrongly on a previous occasion. Would you think it was a bad thing that if you had committed the crime on the second occasion, the fact they had your fingerprints allowed that to be discovered?
Look, we would all be much safer.
So what do you say to that?
Well, I say to that question,
that's a good thing.
Well, so put this to you quite simply. I've no doubt we'd all be much safer and more secure from all kinds of crimes and other threats if we all went around with barcodes tattooed on our foreheads, which could be read by machines.
Peter, you avoid having a proper debate about that. If you simply give absurd examples.
You won't let me finish the question. I say, of course, that would be so. But the question is, it would be too high a price to pay. Surely the question that lies in front of any government, which is concerned both with protecting the liberty of the subject and with protecting the safety of the subject, the question which lies in front of the government is how far can it legitimately go?
Yeah, absolutely right. And I think it's a question of balance. You've got to focus extremely carefully on the extent to which it intrudes on the privacy and the liberty of the subject. So take the DNA swab example. If the 24,000 DNA swabs taken from people who are not subsequently charged with a crime or are charged but are acquitted materially helped in the conviction of a significant number of offenders, it might well be that that factor justified the retention of the swabs, which you agree with, I think.
But that's but you're arguing simply that the end justifies the means.
No, I'm not.
Isn't there any point at which you say this goes too far?
Of course. And
well, where is it?
Well, DNA swabs from those who are arrested and then either acquitted or not charged, if that materially helps in the identification of criminals and leads to legitimate convictions, I think the balance there is in favour of allowing it.
So, for the government, the ends do justify the means. David is now highly suspicious.
And now it really worries me that those details are on record, and the sort of information the government holds on you, it scares me to know what could happen next, when the next knock at the door will be.
They tell you that if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. Well, that wasn't David Atkinson's experience. Those records are on the largest DNA database in the world, containing details of many, many innocent people. You could be on it if you chanced to be arrested for a driving offence. Nothing to hide? Nothing to fear? Are you absolutely sure of that?
The government's relentless push for identity cards means that all of us will eventually be registered and recorded in a way once reserved for convicted criminals. That means tens of millions of new opportunities for the police to jump to conclusions about anyone, even you. Once, our police were the servants of the law and of the people. In a startling change, they began to carry out the political will of the state. And the state itself, claiming to act in our interests, has been gathering increasingly detailed information on us. These growing databases are only one of the ways in which it seeks to pry into our lives. London's Leicester Square is the sort of place people come to relax, to shop, watch a movie or have a drink. But in a deep cellar nearby, the formidable surveillance system watches and records the actions of thousands. The argument for all this is that it fights crime. But is it really much use for that purpose?
It's not actually going to be very effective at stopping them from doing things which are minor nuisances, which are the main problem.
Some people are doing major nuisances. What we do when we see that is immediately alert the police, and they go and try and sort it out.
You couldn't call the police or expect them to do anything. By the time they got there, the person would be gone.
I agree, but if you see somebody pull a knife out in a fight, then you can and do, and they've been successful in stopping that kind of situation, really escalating into something very bad.
Doesn't it ever so slightly give you the creeps to see this level of surveillance on a British street?
I'm entirely happy knowing that I may be picked up on a CCTV camera a dozen times a day, because if I'm doing nothing wrong, I have some great satisfaction in knowing nothing's going to happen as a result of it.
One of the pieces of information that ID cards will carry will be one's face. If you then take all the faces from the ID database and you put them into a police-controlled database linked to facial recognition CCTV cameras, then you have one of the most perfect systems of surveillance ever devised.
The pretext for this prison-like surveillance is, as usual, that it will guard us against crime. But will it really? A scarf across the face or a hoodie will easily hide the identity of a wrongdoer, and unlike a patrolling constable, a camera can't intervene to anticipate a crime or do much while it's happening. In any case, do we really want to be watched all the time by authority like this?
You might think that the government now had enough ways of keeping tabs on us. You'd be mistaken. Here at the Imperial War Museum, I've uncovered the history of our state's repeated plans to compel us all to carry identity papers. Plans now returning in a far more fearsome form than ever before. The greatest threat to our freedom yet proposed.
Panic and war have always been the pretext for governments to interfere in the private lives of their citizens. The first identity cards in Britain were issued towards the end of the First World War. The same thing happened, more or less, in 1939. The idea was mocked by many MPs, but it went through Parliament in an afternoon, and the cards were issued. They continued in use into the early 50s, and it was then that people became sick and tired of them, after years and years of officious demands to be shown identity papers by people who knew perfectly well who they were. The government, sensing that the cards would be seriously unpopular if they tried to keep them on any longer, abolished them. And millions of people then did what they had been longing to do for years of war and rationing, and tore them up. Now we have the supposed war on terror, which differs from the previous wars because it has no foreseeable end. And so we will see creeping compulsion to carry identity cards. The new one will contain huge amounts of information about each holder, coded and accessible to all manner of government servants in a way never previously known.
The new identity cards will be very different from those held by other European citizens. Unlike those in France, our cards will contain biometric data, such as fingerprints and eyeball scans. Here, at the National Physical Laboratory, they are already testing the technology that will be used on the proposed identity cards.
Dr. Mansfield, how do you do? So this is the place where you're planning this tremendous step backwards.
By 2008, every applicant for a passport will be compelled to have their retinas scanned, as I'm having mine scanned now.
Please center your eyes in the mirror.
I'm doing as I'm told. Why does it have an American accent?
Because it's made in America.
Ah, I thought as much.
There we are.
Thank you. You have been identified.
Oh, it is not.
It seems likely that within a decade we shall all be forced to carry identity cards at all times. No longer free people, we will be registered like sex offenders or cattle, potential suspects for every offence. The fact that we have not done anything wrong will not stop the state insisting that we account for ourselves.
I understand a driving licence, a permission to drive a dangerous vehicle, but a licence to live. I say that offends my idea of us being born free and equal and presumed innocent.
The government's main argument for identity cards is that they are needed to combat terrorism, but many doubt their effectiveness.
In countries where they have ID cards, there have also been terrorist outrages. Had we had ID cards back in July, when we had the terrorist outrages in London, it's doubtful that they would have prevented those young men from carrying out those attacks.
And even the Lord appointed by the government to examine identity cards is sceptical about how useful they will actually be.
I believe that ID cards might, and I don't think anyone can put it higher than this, might lead to the pre-detection of terrorist acts very occasionally. I'm very much in favour of a voluntary ID card system. I doubt whether one can really make the case that ID cards of a compulsory kind are a proportional response to the terrorism risk.
Once we are forced to present these cards to various forms of authority, we will be leaving a data trail that will give our rulers extraordinary knowledge of what used to be our private lives. The government wishes to introduce identity cards, initially voluntary, but with the very strong implication they will become compulsory. And it also has been introducing procedures under which an arrested person, not a convicted person, can now be swabbed for DNA and fingerprinted. Isn't there a general tendency in this government to reach for the authoritarian solution when it's faced with crime and disorder and difficulty of any kind?
Above all, this government is extremely keen to ensure that people's basic fundamental human rights are protected. You refer to various things, all of which make the system work in a sensible way, none of them remotely undermining the basic freedoms in this country. And I think your thesis is basically flawed, and I think your thesis is also dangerous because it's crying wolf.
Hasn't it been the case throughout history that countries and governments have never abolished liberty, or very seldom abolished liberty by an act of deliberate destruction, but that what has happened is that people in power have used the excuse, the pretext, or indeed the genuine reason of growing crime and disorder to take away the liberties of everybody rather than just those who are causing the crime and disorder? And oughtn't you to be a bit more careful about this?
I'm sure that you are right, that very few regimes ever abolished liberty just like that, though it might well be in Nazi Germany or somewhere that happened. And you're absolutely right that we've got to be vigilant to ensure that our freedoms are not eroded. But I think your thesis that we're becoming a much more restricted, less free country is completely wrong.
I hope I am wrong. But as George Orwell rightly pointed out, the greatest distinction between the English people and all others has always been our desire to live privately. It is precisely that privacy, that freedom, which is menaced by the changes that this government is pursuing in the name of safety and security. Those changes are growing into a serious threat to those they are meant to protect. People like students, peers of the realm, pensioners, train spotters, chefs, teenagers, and people like you.
Would you sacrifice your civil liberties for more security? Go to our poll on channel4.com/dispatches. Trained killers or a bunch of duffers? Paul gets into the real dad's army next up.